All right. Let's see if we are live. I think we are. We're going to act like we are, at least for this, for these purposes.
All right.
Good morning. This is Bernard Nomberg with another weekly episode of Nomberg Law Live, and I have my friend Andrew Maraniss up in Nashville. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Bernard. Thanks for having me on your program. I think it's great that you do
Absolutely.
this.
Well, thank you for spending some time with me. I'm going to share it out to all the platforms that I normally do. But for those of you who don't know Andrew, you really should get to know him and pretty quickly. Andrew and I actually were on campus for a couple of years at the same time, didn't know each other. Andrew is a journalist, he is an author, a New York, wrote most recently the book that has the most publicity is about former Vanderbilt basketball player Perry Wallace. And we'll get into all those details in just a minute. But Andrew, if you would, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and a little bit about your background.
Sure. So my background, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I was born in Wisconsin, but grew up in D.C. where my dad was a journalist at the Washington Post for going on 40 plus years now, I suppose. And we moved to Austin, Texas when I was in high school. And one day I was in the building at Austin High, and there was a poster on the wall advertising a sports writing scholarship to Vanderbilt. And it was the Fred Russell Grantland Rice Sports Writing Scholarship, which is really unusual, but probably the only one in the country geared towards high school sports writers. And that was the reason why I applied to Vandy. And I remember one day at towards the end of the school year, my mom and my sister showed up at school. My mom was crying. I had no idea why she was there or why she was crying. And it was, I have an 8-year-old daughter now. She talks about happy tears. And so these were happy tears. And my mom said, Vandy called and you won this scholarship. And so that's how I ended up here. And it all kind of ties together to your question. While I was a student, I learned about Perry Wallace for the first time. It was actually an article written by Dave Sheinin, who was a year ahead of me in school. He's now a sports writer of national renown at the Washington Post, and he wrote a story about Perry's first game at Mississippi State, his freshman year, and Perry Wallace being the first black player in SEC basketball, and how concerned he was that he was going to get shot and killed just for stepping on the court in that basketball game. And I was taking an African American history course at the time, wrote a paper about Perry, and then 17 years later came back to what I had always thought was the most interesting thing I did in college, and decided to write a biography of Perry Wallace. It took me 8 years to do that. Strong Inside came out in 2014. About a year and a half later, I created a middle school version of the book, and had a career in public relations. I worked here at Vanderbilt for 5 years, for the Tampa Bay Rays for a year, doing media relations, and then was at a firm here in Nashville for almost 20 years. But through that process of writing the book, was kind of reminded of my love for writing and writing about sports, and but sports in a way that had, with bigger issues attached to it. And so what I'm doing now is writing books for middle school kids and high school kids about sports and history, nonfiction. And I'm also working back at Vanderbilt again, helping to run a sports and society program that former athletic director David Williams launched last year, writing for the Vanderbilt website and assisting the new athletic director, Malcolm Turner, with various special projects. So my day job I love here at Vandy, but I'm really appreciative of the chance to continue to write also, especially for young people. I think it's so important that they develop a love of reading, and I love to use sports as a way to introduce more serious issues to them.
Well, thank you for that introduction and that history. So many questions, and I'll just start with this. By chance, was he teaching the Black History class that you taught, or do you
Yes,
remember?
Professor Jimmy Franklin.
Yeah.
I had him not for that first class that I wrote about Perry for. That was Dr. Yolette Jones, who was in her first year as a Vanderbilt professor, and she's still here. And I had a chance to teach a course with her last year, which was
Oh,
really
wow.
sort of a fun, full
Yeah.
circle experience. But I did have Professor Franklin the next year, and he allowed us to continue to work on something that we had started previously. So I wrote another paper about Perry Wallace
Oh, wow.
for Professor Franklin as well. Did you have him too?
I did. I'm wondering if we had classes together now that I think
Oh,
back.
could have been. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go. Gosh, there's so many topics we could talk about, Andrew. But let's stick on Mr. Wallace. I know that he passed away in 2017. You were blessed to have many years of a friendship and to interview him and his life story. From what little I do know, I know that Mr. Wallace uh, grew up in Nashville, Pearl High School on fabulous basketball teams. Got to play at Vanderbilt, I think for the state championship, maybe his senior year. But pick up the story, if you will, from his senior year at Pearl High School, and just kind of give us the highlights of why you wrote this book, and where Mr. Wallace fits into not just the Southeastern Conference history with sports, but in the South. What a difference he made, because he truly did.
Oh, he truly did, and he's one of the most significant figures in the history of American sports, and most people don't know a thing about him. As you mentioned, he grew up in Nashville. He was always a brilliant kid. He was a real Renaissance man from early age, playing the trumpet, speaking foreign languages. I think he spoke 3 languages by the time he got to high school,
Wow.
teaching Sunday school class. Um, his high school girlfriend said he was the nicest kid at the school. He was also the smartest. He was valedictorian of his class at Pearl High School. And he
Almost
was
too good to be true.
yeah, really.
Huh?
And he was stayed that way throughout the whole course of his life. Just an amazing
Wow.
person. He was the starting center on the best team in the state. So Pearl High won state championship his sophomore year. They won the state championship his junior year.
Wow.
And then his senior year was the first year that the State High School Association in Tennessee brought all the schools together. So white schools and black schools. And so his sophomore and junior year, they won the black state tournament in Tennessee. 66 was the first year that everyone played in the same tournament. And Pearl High went undefeated that year and won the state championship at Memorial Gym at Vanderbilt, as you mentioned, on March 19th, 1966, which is an important date in American sports history, especially basketball. It's the same day that Texas Western beat Kentucky in the NCAA championship game, the Glory Road game. All black Texas Western against Adolph Rupp's all white Kentucky school. Same thing happened at the high school level in Tennessee. Perry's being recruited by schools all over the country. He said he was taking the first airplane trips of his life, going to visit pretty much every school in the Big Ten. John Wooden at UCLA was recruiting Perry. And he told me that his whole goal at that point in his life was to get out of Nashville. He had grown up in this segregated city in the South where he saw his mom receive the worst kind of derogatory attacks you could imagine. He had to walk to the back of the bus. You know, he had to drink from separate water fountains. All the things you read about in segregation is what Perry had experienced as a kid. And so he thought this was his opportunity to finally to get away, to get to another part of the country where he might be treated more equally. And unfortunately, he started to see sort of the ugly side of college sports that you still see today, and it was the cheating. And Perry was a real straight arrow. You know, he was a serious student. He listened to his parents. He was not one that was going to get into any trouble. And so when he started showing up at some schools and they said, well, here's a pile of cash for you, and if you come to our school, there'll be an even bigger pile, you know, or here's a car for you for your recruiting trip, and we'll give you a nicer car if you choose to come to our school. Perry was not enticed by that. And worst of all to him was when he would show up at a school and they would say, if you come here, we'll find the easiest classes for you, or you don't even have to go to class. You're just here to play basketball. And to Perry, that was the worst thing he could hear. He wanted a real education. He had a poetic and provocative way of describing this. He said that he wasn't going to trade one plantation for another, and he wasn't going to leave the Deep South where he wasn't treated as an equal person just to be exploited for the fact he was 6'5" and he was strong and he could dunk at one of these other schools that didn't value him as a student. And so that's why he began to take Vanderbilt seriously, which, you know, in some ways makes perfect sense. Here's a school that's maybe 2 miles from his house, right? But in other ways, this was a school that didn't desegregate its undergraduate student body till 1964, when Perry was 16 years old. So this wasn't a place that he grew up thinking, maybe someday I'll play basketball at Vanderbilt. This was a school that was saying, we don't want you here. But on his recruiting trip, he saw players going to class. He was impressed with the engineering school. Coach Roy Skinner was respectful to his parents, which he said did not often happen of older or any white person being respectful to his parents. And so that had meant a lot to him. And ultimately, he chose to come knowing that it was going to be a difficult and dangerous experience as a pioneer, not really because he set out to do it, but almost in spite of the fact that he'd be a pioneer. But at least he could get a good education. His parents would be able to see him play, and he'd be able to play major college basketball. And those were his goals.
You know, I never had the privilege of spending any time or getting to meet Mr. Wallace, but from what I read in your book and the interviews that I've watched online, it really appears that he also not only had the intellect and not only had the determination, but he had the right temperament, the right personality to be able to handle all that he endured, not just growing up and being in his community at Pearl, but later on at Vanderbilt, especially playing sports, basketball all around the Southeast. I suspect that his temperament probably paid, and maybe this is a tribute to his parents, paid a huge part of how he was able to successfully maneuver all of those difficult times.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think maneuver is a good word also that you use, because Perry was very thoughtful. In some cases, I think that actually made the experience more difficult for him because he absorbed everything that was coming his way and was hurt by it, but did never let it stop him. He wasn't going to give the satisfaction to the people that hated him of quitting, who wanted him to quit. He always was thinking several steps ahead in order to ensure that this journey would continue. He knew it was a really fine line. Like at any moment, it could all be over, So when Martin Luther King was assassinated, he knew there was going to be a peaceful march from the Vanderbilt campus to a church in downtown Nashville that he wanted to participate in because he had really admired King so much. He also knew that there would be some people that would try to portray this march as a protest. People who didn't like King, people who would not like the fact that Perry was marching in support of Martin Luther King, which to modern ears can be hard, especially when I'm talking to students. It's hard for them to understand. There were people that didn't like Martin Luther King. There were a lot of people that didn't like Martin Luther King in the South, white people. And so when Perry was going to participate in this peaceful march, he went and came down to the athletics department and talked to administrators here about why he was doing it, why it was important to him, so that they would have that understanding, and it wouldn't be a case where some alumni complains Perry was in this protest and all of a sudden he's kicked off the basketball team.
Sure.
So when you talk about the temperament he had, yes, he was dealing with incredible hostility and racism on the road, places like Starkville, Mississippi, and Oxford, but also dealing with it in his own home environment on campus, and he had to be very thoughtful about the way he approached things. At least he believed he did, in order to continue this. There was no guarantee it was going to work out. He wanted to finish what he started, and he was very proud that he did that.
Well, by the time he was a senior, things, at least from within the sports world, had changed somewhat. And I know that he was a highly decorated and honored student athlete by the time his playing career had finished at Vanderbilt. So just in a short period of time, he must have made some real impressions on and off the court.
No, he did, but even that was a bit controversial. So by his senior year, he was team captain. He was voted, they had an SEC Sportsmanship Award at the time that he received. Back then, there was an award on campus called Bachelor of Ugliness that was voted on by the student body, and it sounds like a derogatory term, but it was actually voted like the most popular male student on campus, essentially. And Perry won that award. And oftentimes, people would point to that as a sign of what incredible progress had been made over the 4 years Perry was on campus. And Perry believed that to a certain extent, but also he kind of pushed back on that idea also and would say, yes, people may have voted for me for this, but they didn't really make an effort to try to get to know me while I was on campus. And he didn't want this award to sort of cover up all the reality of the situation, where the fraternity parties on campus, they might have a black band playing at the party, but you couldn't join that fraternity if you were African American, or basically no African American professors on campus. You might show up for class and no one chooses to sit next to you because of who he was, or they'd cross the street, as he's walking down the street. So sure, they voted for him, but was there more meaningful interaction preceding that? In a lot of cases, there wasn't.
That vote for the award may have been a matter of white guilt and people voting anonymously, where they didn't have to show that how they really felt, but they couldn't publicly show it at times. So I certainly can understand why that may have been somewhat of a hollow award for him. Somewhat.
Yeah, there may have been an element of that, and I don't think that everyone that voted for Perry had any ulterior motives for it. A lot of people did admire Perry from a distance. Part of the issue that he dealt with was just getting over and Perry talked often about kids of that generation had to live in this segregated system that people long before them set up, and that Vanderbilt could and should have been a place, and college experience could and should have been a place where people practiced getting to know each other, and practiced for the real world that they would be entering later. And he really enjoyed those few cases where that did happen. And Perry was looking to make friends with all sorts of people. He thought that was one of the purposes of going to college, is interacting with different types of people. And he was always seeking those opportunities, and he was sorely disappointed when others didn't seek out those opportunities the way he did.
For those of you just joining us or watching live or watching later on the recorded part, I'm talking with author and journalist Andrew Maraniss. Andrew with Vanderbilt University. His after work hours, he is an avid writer currently of high school and junior high books. Andrew, I could talk to you all day about Mr. Wallace. I know that he became a very successful attorney, resided in D.C., and then sadly passed away about 2 years ago. But where can people, if they want to read the book or if they want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Okay, thanks for setting that one up, Bernard. If anyone's interested in reading the book, it's called Strong Inside. It's a biography of Perry, and there's actually 2 versions of it. So I wrote the original version for adults, and then was encouraged to create a young readers edition, which would be more for middle school or high school students. I always encourage people first to go to their local bookstore. If they don't have it, you can ask them to order it. The book is on Amazon. Both versions are as well, or barnesandnoble.com, or IndieBound is a good website people can go to buy books through local bookstores. Also, my website, andrewmaraniss.com, has links to several places where you can purchase the book.
And we'll put all those links in the comment section after our discussion. Let's pivot for a minute. Let's talk about the other book that I know of yours, about the 1936 Nazi Olympics. Talk to us a little bit about that book and what's it about, and how did that topic become a topic for you to write about?
Okay, yeah, so the book is called Games of Deception. It will be coming out November 5th, so still several months from now, but people can pre-order it at all those same places that we just mentioned. It's about the first U.S. Olympic basketball team, which played at the 36 Olympics in Nazi Germany. It wasn't a topic that I have had on my mind for years. Actually, this one, I was out at the University of Kansas speaking about Perry Wallace and Strong Inside, and I had never been to Allen Fieldhouse there before, and so I really wanted to do that while I was in Lawrence, and I took a tour. They have a really great building called the DeBruce Center that's attached to it now, where they have behind glass the original rules of basketball from when James Naismith invented the game. They have a whole Kansas basketball museum and Hall of Fame, which was just as good as the National Hall of Fame.
I'm sure.
Consider all the great history they've had there. And James Naismith was their first basketball coach, the inventor of basketball. He's also the only coach at Kansas with a losing record. The guy invented the sport, and he had a losing record as coach at KU. And one time during that tour, the man who was giving me the tour, showed me a picture of James Naismith with a Japanese basketball player. And he mentioned, did you know that Naismith was there in Berlin to see his invention become an Olympic sport? And I didn't know that. And that's initially where I got the idea to write this story. I don't think most people, even sports fans, basketball fans, realize that's where basketball had its Olympic debut. It's obviously a fascinating Olympics, and there's been great books like Boys in the Boat, written about the American crew at that Olympics, or books like Triumph by Jeremy Schaap about Jesse Owens, and so many interesting topics you can write about related to those games. And what I like to do in my books is to use sports to write about other social issues. So this book deals with the early days of fascism and what that looked like in Germany in the years leading up to the Olympics. There was a significant boycott effort in the United States leading up to those Olympics, which obviously didn't succeed. We participated in those Olympics. But in doing the research, discovered there was a pretty close coordination between Avery Brundage and the American Olympic Committee and the German organizers in Nazi Germany to influence American public opinion about the Nazis and about Germany, and that there was essentially a propaganda campaign here also to ensure that we would participate in those Olympics. The way the American team was formed that year I found really interesting. It wasn't individuals trying out for the team the way they do now. There was basically the first national basketball tournament. This was before the NCAA tournament existed, and it was Phog Allen, the coach at Kansas, who really pushed for basketball to be included in the Olympics. He was instrumental in creating the NCAA tournament. And what they did is they had a tournament of the top amateur teams in the country. So you had teams from the YMCAs, which were still a big deal at the time.
Right.
Some college teams, and then also AAU teams, which were different than they are now. It wasn't high school players. It was guys that had already graduated from college would go work at a company that would have a company basketball team. And so they maintained their amateur status by technically being paid to work at the company, and they just happened to play for their basketball team. And so they had a tournament at Madison Square Garden. The top two teams would then be combined to become the U.S. Olympic team. And so those two teams were the Globe Refiners from McPherson, Kansas, and the team from Universal Pictures in Hollywood. And so these two teams from such different parts of the country with such different experiences were brought together to become the U.S. Olympic team that year. And so I tell that whole history in the book as well.
Well, you know, that those Olympics, obviously the story of Jesse Owens and that history is what's much more known, but I'll be very interested to read this, and I'm looking forward to that book coming out. I know you'll be proud of your work.
Thank you.
And that's in November that'll be coming out?
Comes out November 5th, and technically it'll be marketed as a young adult book, but I'm trying to write these books. You know, you're a sports fan. You hear about like a stretch four in basketball who maybe is a power forward, but they can kind of play that center position, or they can shoot from outside. Like I try to write in a versatile way also where, maybe the book will be marketed towards middle and high school kids, but I've written it in a way that adults will enjoy it too. And the only difference really is that it's a bit shorter than a typical book for adults. It's the kind of book you could read in a week or a weekend rather than slogging through it for a month.
Well, for those of you just joining us, either live or later on, I'm talking with author Andrew Maraniss. And Andrew, I appreciate your time, and I want to kind of pivot to talk about what's going on campus right now. It's the springtime. It's my favorite time of the year for many reasons, but most notably, Coach Corbin and his Vandy boys look to be in prime. They just destroyed Florida this past weekend. But as you and I both know, in SEC play, you don't get a weekend off. With Tennessee, this and then all sometimes.
Hey, Bernard, it cut out there for a minute, but I know you were talking about the Vanderbilt baseball team and just
Yeah.
the strength of the SEC.
Oh my gosh. If you look at the current top 10, I think half of it's SEC teams. Have you had a chance to go see them play yet this year?
I have, and I love baseball. That's sort of always been my sport. I'm even coaching my son's team this year. He's a 5-year-old. It's his first time playing. We've got our first game tonight. So this year, my baseball attention will be divided between 5-year-olds, Vanderbilt students, and my team, the Milwaukee Brewers. um, but yeah, it's an amazing team, fantastic players. I think the thing that's so special about the Vanderbilt baseball team is just the entire culture that Coach Corbin has built around that program and the way former players come back every off season to work out, or just the way they talk about their experience. I know Dansby Swanson was on a video with the Braves the other day talking about how much his Vanderbilt experience had meant to him, and it's really quite special to see. And I know both of us as Vanderbilt students experienced a very different baseball setup where, like you said, it was a chain link fence, and I used to work at the games as a student and a young graduate with the media relations. We didn't have a press box. We sat at a card table on top of the dugout and held up a microphone to a boom box to play the music between innings. And
I remember those.
it's quite a program now, and it's really amazing to see what Corbin has built there.
And it's so enjoyable to see the success of so many players. I think he's had over 40 All-Americas. I don't know all the statistics. So many guys drafted in the first round, but not just that, but just giving back to the community, which happens from time to time. I hope you're able to hear and follow what I'm saying. But I hope that wherever the program goes for Vanderbilt baseball this year and for your son's T-ball, I'm not going to say the same for the Milwaukee Brewers because I'm a Braves fan, sorry. But hopefully at the end of all of those seasons, as we were talking about earlier, there'll be happy tears at the end of each of the seasons for everybody involved. Andrew, I can't thank you enough for hanging in there with me on these Wi-Fi issues and sharing some time talking about what's going on, not just in your writing world, but also in what's going on campus. So thank you for spending some time with me today.
Well, thank you, Bernard. I think it's great what you're doing and interviewing interesting people. I've had a chance to look and see some of your other interviews, and I know for authors especially, we really appreciate these opportunities because it's a tough business trying to make it as an author. Word of mouth is what really means the most, and that's why people decide to pick up books that they've heard just their friends say, hey, I read this book, it was interesting, and more so than any type of advertising or anything you can do, or conversations like this is what really matters, and I'm really grateful to have this chance to talk to you. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure, and I hope next month, if I can come up for some baseball games, we'll be able to share some time together.
Yeah, that'll be fun. I'll look forward to it.
Well, guys, this is another weekly episode of NOMBERG LAW Live with Andrew Maraniss this week. Thank you for hanging in there with my Wi-Fi issues. It happens. There's nothing I can control. We just do the best that we can each week. We'll be back again next Tuesday at 10 o'clock Central, 8 a.m. Pacific. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week. Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Anchor down.
Anchor down.